You might be wondering, why the red? Why the green? Why are you in complete darkness? Seems a little intense. Well, that's because on today's episode of Hollywood Legends, things do get a little intense. In cinematography, green can be used to represent youth, whilst red can be used to represent anger. In today's tale, we explore a story that has elements of both. Get comfortable and enjoy yourselves for another episode of Hollywood Legends. Episode 1, Marty's Got a Gun. So the video we're going to be watching today comes from a live television event that happened in 2009 by the British television company Skymovies. In this event, Quentin Tarantino hosted the night, where he relayed the top 25 movies that have come out since he's been a filmmaker. And during his top 5, he lists off Taxi Driver, and he relays a very interesting Hollywood legend. And I'll pull that video up on the screen right here at my computer, and we'll figure out afterwards whether or not there's any substantiality to these claims. We'll look at a couple articles, and we'll dig a little bit. So, nonetheless, let's get straight to it.
Now, there is an interesting history behind Taxi Driver that's definitely worth noting. It's one of those things that's fallen down into Hollywood legend. I have no idea if it's true. I have no idea how much of it's true, if any of it's true. But to me, it's the most interesting legend of during that decade of the movie brats. What happened?
The movie
was,
brats he's referring
Scorsese
to De Palma, Spielberg,
made Taxi Driver, and he'd finished it. And
Scorsese.
You can imagine the work that is Taxi Driver. If you had made it and completed it, you would be understandably happy. Truthfully, I can't even imagine what it'd be like to make Taxi Driver.
That's a genuine moment.
However,
right
he
there.
made the film for
beautiful.
Columbia, and the MPAA slapped it with an X. And so Scorsese was now going to have to be faced with making a masterpiece that he thinks is perfect and having to slash his canvas. And the people or person at Columbia, who I don't have a clue who it is or if this even happened at all, was unsympathetic. They didn't care. They would just get an R. Just get an R. We don't care how you do it, just do it. And the legend goes that Scorsese stayed up all night drinking, getting drunk with a loaded gun.
Maybe some cocaine too. We'll talk about that.
Was in the morning he was going to shoot the executive at Columbia for making him cut his masterpiece. And it turned out to be a vigil all night as Scorsese sat there with a loaded gun in his lap, and some of his fellow filmmakers and friends came and talked to him and commiserated with him and tried to talk him out of it. And apparently this lasted all night long.
Probably De Palma,
I've heard stories
Spielberg.
that literally all of them grew up that night because they realized how serious Scorsese was at the prospect of what he was going to do. Well, apparently what ended up happening is by the end of the night, by truly contemplating shooting the man and knowing he was going to do that, when that became such a reality, he did reach inside of himself to try to find one other thing he could do other than commit murder. And the idea that came to him was just to desaturate the color in the final shootout by 2 degrees, turning what was candy
How
apple
would that
blood
make the
red
difference?
into a more burgundy blood. He did that in lieu of killing a man, and the film got its R. And that's a Taxi Driver uncut as you see today. Again, Mr. Scorsese, if none of this has happened, I apologize. I am simply relating legend. But I can honestly say, as an artist, if it's not true, I wish it were.
Yep.
This is Quentin
I agree.
Tarantino. You are watching Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. Enjoy.
I absolutely love that story. That's like one of my favorite kind of rumors of Hollywood I've ever heard. The fact that it didn't actually happen, like he didn't actually go and shoot anybody, it just adds a little character and a little bit of romance to the whole story of Taxi Driver. An already amazing film. But anyways, the thing I find the hardest to believe of the whole story, even though it's ridiculous in many ways, I find it hard to believe that just desaturating the color would really make that much of a difference. It's just very odd to me. But anyways, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to bring up an article on screen that kind of talks about this, and then it also brings up an interview that Brian De Palma did and tries to shed light on whether or not this Hollywood legend that Quentin Tarantino relays, we got to figure out if there's any legitimacy to it. So we'll look at this article and then we'll read it, and I'll get it on screen in just a second. All right, so on screen here, I'm going to bring up this article from Bedford and Bowery. And this was, believe it or not, like the only article I was able to find online regarding this subject. And this was written in June 9th, 2016 by Daniel Maurer, or Maurer, however you might pronounce it. And the article is titled Brian De Palma Sheds Light on a Crazy Rumor About Martin Scorsese and Taxi Driver. Now let's read the first paragraph here, the first bit of the paragraph, because that's what's relevant. Last night, as part of this month's Brian De Palma retrospective at Metrograph, the director himself sat down for a Q&A after a screening of his 1970 comedy Hi Mom. So this is the setting for the questions that are asked, the Q&A. Let's go down here and let's read this bit. The so-called movie brats, which Quentin talked about, are the subject of a fun bit of Hollywood lore that resurfaced last night when an audience member brought up a story popularized by Quentin Tarantino. Introducing Taxi Driver for Skymovies, Tarantino relayed a Hollywood legend, which he admitted may or may not have been true, about how Columbia Pictures demanded that Scorsese recut the film so it would get an R rather than an X. All right, so this part of the article goes over what we just heard. Here we go. Ultimately, Tarantino recounts, Scorsese decided to desaturate the color in the final shootout to make the blood less disturbing. Asked last night whether the story was true or just an exaggeration, De Palma responded, "This is the problem when you get old," meaning he couldn't remember exactly what happened. The audience laughed and De Palma clarified, quote, "I remember very distinctly being in the screening room and seeing these jerk-offs saying, quote, you gotta take that out, you gotta take, and Marty just dying because they were chopping up his movie," unquote. De Palma, who introduced Scorsese to De Niro and also gave the director Paul Schrader's script for Taxi Driver, said he didn't want to be quoted on it because he wasn't sure his memory was accurate. My reaction to that is, if Marty did want to kill a Columbia executive, then De Palma might be having selective memory loss right now, or, he is actually having memory loss because he is quite old. So either way, but I am a little skeptical about that, to be honest. That's one of those things that you don't really forget, I'd guess. But we're going to continue reading here. But, quote, "I remember seeing this thing and saying this has got to stop. So I remember talking to New York critic Pauline Kael and arranging a screening for her to see it, I think in Chicago. And I said to Marty, send the picture and let Kael look at it. Once I know she's seen it and she starts talking about it, this is all going to be over. And that's, as I recall, that's what happened," unquote. Okay, but what about Scorsese plotting to go Travis Bickle on a studio exec? That's pretty funny. De Palma didn't address that part of the story, but a definitive account appears in Easy Rider's Raging Bulls, according to Peter Bisking's History of 1970s Hollywood. Scorsese called De Palma to his Mulholland Drive home, along with fellow directors John Milius and Steven Spielberg. The question is, was Marty drunk? It's uncertain, but according to Taxi Driver co-producer Julia Phillips, he would often pop lewds and drink Dom Perignon in the cutting room. Now, this claim from Julia Phillips, I tried to look into it, and she apparently wrote like a tell-all book in which this statement is derived from. And I wasn't able to find it like easily accessible on the internet, this statement of hers, but nonetheless, I don't really see any reason that this person would be making this up. And from other sources, I do see that Martin Scorsese was, doing quite an amount of drugs at that time. But whether he was heavily abusing drugs during Taxi Driver is the real question. Because the confirmation I was able to get is by looking online is that he was definitely using drugs shortly after Taxi Driver, and for 2 years following until he decided to kind of cut it a little bit. But anyways, let's go further in the article. Spielberg recalls that Scorsese, after being told to recut the film, pointed a finger at Stanley Jeff and said, "He's the head of the studio. He's the guy I'm angry at. I'm gonna get a gun and shoot him." He wasn't serious about it, but he was relishing the rage, and he wanted us to share his anger. The book goes on to describe how Phillips took a print to New York to show Cale. When Jaffa found out that the Times critic had seen a cut of the movie and loved it, he flipped out. So much so that Scorsese, afraid that the print would be seized, had to sneak it off the lot. In the end, however, Scorsese agreed to desaturate the color in the finale and eliminate the few frames that showed blood spraying from severed fingers. Of course, De Palma has also had his run-ins with the MPAA and studios, as we noted in our write-up, which, I'm going to provide this article in the description so you can click on this link if you want to and look into that. He has gotten himself into trouble off-screen as well. Last night, he explained it with typical candor. Quote, "When you work in such a duplicitous profession, you want to tell it like it is, but you can't, because you'll never work again. So the best interviews I used to see were guys in the Hollywood old age home." Unquote. All right, so I'm going to bring an article up here that is going to give us an idea of, what kind of mind state was Marty in during these times. And, it's going to give us a little bit more of an idea of whether or not this Hollywood legend relayed by Quentin Tarantino, whether or not it was possible. So let's read about the drug use, and we'll get an idea of what kind of state of mind he was in. Here, we're going to start with "You Can Make 5 Films at Once" on rehabreviews.com. This was written by Paul Fuhr. For those of you who want the nitty-gritty, once Taxi Driver received accolades, Scorsese began regularly using cocaine, quaaludes, and alcohol, according to a mental floss feature on the director. The creative charge he got from cocaine was too much to ignore. Quote, "At first you felt like you could make 5 films at once," unquote, he said. Quote, "And then you would wind up spending 4 days in bed every week because you were exhausted and your body couldn't take it," unquote. The article claims that his addiction quickly took over, reaching a low point at the 1978 Cannes Film Festival, where he was giving an interview to interview reporters. During that time, Scorsese ran out of cocaine. He quickly sent a private plane to Paris to back a fresh supply to get him through his press obligations. In the meantime, cocaine wasn't doing his personality any favors. He says, quote, "I was always angry, throwing glasses, provoking people, really unpleasant to be around," he recalled in the mental floss story. Quote, "I always found out, no matter what anybody said, something to take offense at. Quote, "I always found out, no matter what anybody said, something to take offense at some point during the evening, I'd flip out." The wording kind of fucked me up there. The director would later call his time with cocaine a 2-year abyss from which he barely came out alive. While he points to his drug abuse as nothing more than self-destruction, One has to wonder if he somehow managed to perfectly translate all that pain, pathos, and desperation on the screen, having personally experienced it himself. Quote, "It was a matter of pushing the envelope, of being bad, seeing how much you can do," he said. Quote, "Embracing a way of life to its limit. I did a lot of drugs because I wanted to do a lot. I wanted to push all the way to the very end and see if I could die." Unquote. Wow. Seems like he was dealing with issues during that time, you know? And then let's read this last half because I think it's very interesting. Scorsese almost succeeded that Labor Day, according to the Mental Floss feature, when he and his friends were sold some bad coke. This was the turning point for Scorsese, both physically and mentally. Quote, "A number of things had happened," unquote, he told the reporter, blaming medication abuse and dangerous combination of drugs. His asthma medication, for one, set off a chain reaction that caused a massive internal bleeding. Quote, "I was kept in a hospital for 10 days and nights, and they took care of me, these doctors, and I became aware of not wanting to die and not wanting to waste my life," unquote. During that time, Scorsese also became aware of something else, himself. The feature notes that while he was visited by family friends like Robert De Niro, he was largely alone in the hospital, thinking back on his childhood as a Catholic boy growing up in the New York's Little Italy. He felt that his upbringing in the church would get him through the tough times ahead. Quote, "I was stunned by the realization of my naivety and denial," he says. Quote, "I prayed, but if I prayed, it was just to get through those 10 days and nights. I felt, if I was saved, it was for some reason. And even if it wasn't for a reason, I had to make good use of it," unquote. As the reporter says, quote, when Scorsese emerged from that dark night of the soul, like the blind man in the Bible, he felt the scales were removed from his eyes, unquote. And as a result, the rest of us get to see some of the most wondrous films ever made. Thank you for watching.